quiet morning day over the Atlantic as Air Transat Flight 236 is having to glide itself across without engines or fuel. A test of skill and fortitude, how did the pilots manage to land a deadweight plane across the Atlantic Ocean? August 2001. Air Transat 236 is waiting at Toronto preparing for an overnight Atlantic flight to Lisbon. The aircraft being used for Flight 236 is a 2-year-old Airbus A330-200 registered as Charlie Golf India Tango Sierra. The plane was manufactured in 1999, being delivered to Air Transat on the 28th of April 1999. The plane had over 10,400 hours of flight time spread across 2,400 flight cycles by August 2001. Inside the cockpit, the plane was piloted by 48-year-old Captain Robert Pichet, who had around 16,800 hours of flight time, with 796 of them being on the A330. Captain Pichet is also an experienced glider pilot, which will come in useful later on. Along with Captain Pichet is First Officer Dirk de Jager with around 4,800 hours of flight time with 386 hours on the A330. Along with the two pilots are 11 cabin crew members handling the 293 passengers on board, leaving for a total of 306 people. Nearing midnight on August 23, 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 is parked at Toronto's Pearson International Airport preparing for an overnight flight to Lisbon, Portugal. They were originally supposed to take off at 8:10 p.m. local time, but they took off 40 minutes later at 8:52 p.m. local time or 12:52 UTC, which is the time which we'll be using for the rest of the video. They headed eastbound towards the Atlantic Ocean. Flight 236 flew across Canada towards the Atlantic with nothing out of the blue for the first few hours of flight. However, at 4:36 a.m. UTC, 4 hours into flight while still in the middle of the Atlantic, Flight 236's right engine started leaking fuel. The right engine was leaking more than 3.6 kilograms per second, and with the plane being loaded with 49,600 kilograms of fuel in Toronto, they burned through at least 15,900 kilograms by then, which meant at this rate the plane would lose all its fuel in an hour. The pilots noticed something unusual around 30 minutes later at 5:03, with engine 2's oil indicators being at unusual levels with low temperatures and high pressures. The pilots sent out a dispatch to Air Transat's maintenance control at Montreal. They continued flying across the Atlantic, but at 5:33, the pilots saw that they had a fuel imbalance, with the right wing's fuel tanks being abnormally low compared to the rest of the plane. This should have indicated a leak, with the low fuel levels being only on the right wing. But instead of referring for the checklist, the pilots attempted to correct the imbalance by cross-feeding fuel from the other tanks towards the right wing tank, which would lead to their fuel also draining out. By 5:45, the fuel was low enough that the pilots had to divert to Lajes Airfield, located in the Azores, a small island group owned by Portugal in the middle of the Atlantic. Flight 236 by then had around 7,000 kilograms of remaining fuel, giving them only around 20 to 30 minutes of fuel left. They contacted Santa Maria Control at 5:48, informing them that they were diverting to the Azores due to a fuel emergency. At this time, they were not fully aware of what was causing the leak. They were contacting maintenance over in Montreal at this time, asking for recommendations on their situation. By 5:59, their fuel was only at 1,100 kilograms by now. A few minutes later, at 6:13, while the plane was flying at 39,000 feet and 100 nautical miles away from Lajes Field, engine 2 flamed out for fuel exhaustion. They notified Santa Maria Control and began descending to 33,000 feet. They sent a mayday to Santa Maria Control at 6:23, telling them about the engine flameout and fuel situation. At 6:26, while they were at 34,500 feet and 65 nautical miles away from Lajes, engine 1 also flamed out, leaving them with no thrust and having to glide all the way to the Azores. The plane's ram air turbine deployed, which acts as a mini engine below the plane, giving them power to use the most basic instruments and controls. They had a descent of around 2,000 feet per minute, which meant from their position they had 200 kilometers of range before hitting the ocean. At 6:31, they contacted Lajes Approach Control, which assisted them on their approach, as at this moment they were 13,000 feet and 8 miles away from runway 33. At the same time, passenger mask dropped in the cabin. Captain Pichet told Lajes that they were going to do a 360-degree left turn to lose altitude as they were too high. While they were turning, they deployed their stats and gear to further drag down their altitude. The pilots then continued doing S-turns as they inched closer to the airport to lose more altitude to get them in line with the runway. However, while the plane was on final, their speed was at a fast 200 knots per second as they continued down. They touched down hard at 6:45, 10,030 feet from runway 33's threshold, with the first touchdown being violent enough that the plane bounced and touched down again at 2,800 feet from the threshold. Upon touchdown, the pilots put max brakes as they couldn't use reverse thrust or their wing spoilers. The brakes were pushed hard considering the plane's anti-skid and brake modulations were inactive from the lack of power. As a result, the wheels on the plane's main gear bursted and started to smoke as they skid across the runway. They came into a stop after using 7,600 feet of the roughly 10,000 feet runway, with all passengers safe and sound on the ground. After the plane stopped, small fires were coming out of the plane's main gear, with the wheels on the main gear deflating after the extreme amount of friction as the plane was slowing down. The pilots ordered an evacuation of the aircraft as airport rescue services swarmed the aircraft, putting out the small fires generated in the main gear. The small fires were quickly extinguished, but the wheels were still smoking. During the evacuation, 16 people received minor injuries, while 2 others getting serious injuries during the evacuation. Either way, all 360 people survived the ordeal, making it safely to the Azores even after losing all their engines in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The investigation was led by Portugal's Aviation Accidents Prevention and Investigation Department as the plane landed in their territory in the Azores. They were also assisted by French and Canadian investigators. They released a report in October 2008 in which they put the main cause as the pilots mishandling the fuel leak, stemming from the part where they weren't able to evaluate the situation and instead of following the normal protocol for fuel leak, they cross-fed the fuel towards the affected wing, which would lead other fuel tanks to drain out of the right wing instead of isolating the right tank's fuel leak. As for what caused the leak in and of itself, it stemmed from a maintenance error from an incorrect fit with the hydraulic system as engine 2 was replaced with a spare engine that didn't have a hydraulic pump. Despite some concerns from mechanics working on the aircraft, Air Transat still authorized the move, which led to the hydraulic and fuel lines not having enough clearance between each other, leading for them to chafe until the fuel line ruptured in mid-flight. After the investigation, Air Transat was fined 250,000 Canadian dollars for the maintenance error on the aircraft. The plane itself was repaired and put back into service by Air Transat. Now nicknamed the Azores Glider, it stayed in service with Air Transat until 2021, where it was returned to a lessor who re-registered it as November 271 Alpha Delta and stored it in Pinal Park, Arizona, where it still is today. The FAA and Directorate General for Civil Aviation issued an airworthiness directive asking all operators of the A320 family to revise their manuals during the event of a fuel imbalance, making sure to check that a leak isn't causing the imbalance before cross-feeding the fuel lines. Other improvements are also made, with Airbus modifying their computer systems to show if a fuel load of the flight is being used up more than usual. The pilots are arraigned as heroes upon returning to Canada for their skill and bravery to get the plane to safety despite the situation. Captain Pichet was awarded the Superior Airmanship Award in 2002. Flight 236 cemented itself in the records as the longest passenger aircraft glide without engines. Impressive for an incident that occurred in the middle of the ocean, and a miracle that the pilots were able to land the 306 people aboard safely. Hey guys, sorry this took a while. I don't know why, but I have been sick for the past few days, and almost every single time I've recorded an episode, I've had a severe cough, which is why Chapter 2 sounded a bit off, but I'm hopefully gonna be doing a little better by next week, and I have a special few episodes planned for December, so let's hope I finish them in time. Anyways, that's it. Bye!